He wanted to tell the Christ story simply, straightforwardly, and as it was, without any embellishment.
He wanted to make a movie that would never be duplicated, that they would never make again. It was to be the definitive story of the life of Christ.
I think he had some idea of making people recognize previous experiences with pieces of art which had made a strong impact on humanity.
A work of art always carries a dignity about it, no matter what the theme is. And I felt that with George in his films very strongly.
I think he wanted a record for posterity of man's inhumanity to man.
The best way you can describe George Stevens is by the way people felt about him. They felt easy with him, and they could make jokes with him, but when it came to directing a picture, they almost stood up and saluted.
He created something of an aura about him. It had to do with his reputation as a director. It had to do with his rather formidable physical presence.
You have to be strong and powerful, otherwise you can't direct. But you can be strong and powerful with a smile and with a kind of a kindness, and you feel it. The actors knew that he loved them, that he had their best interest at heart. And in that case, strong and powerful becomes a tremendous virtue.
He seemed very, very gruff and strict and bearish and tough, and he was the kindest man and maybe the most intellectual man that I ever knew. And I so often find myself quoting George that he hardly seems dead. He's so much alive in what he taught me and other people.
He had a fantastic sense of humor, a very quirky kind, but extraordinary. He was one of the funniest people I know. There was a quality, first of all, in the way he portrayed human beings, but a kind of truthfulness. He gave the characters a kind of weight and a kind of reality and a sort of compassion. That, plus the quality of humor he had, was almost unique.
I would describe George as a serious man, particularly, perhaps, on this picture. He cared terribly about it.
Originally, The Greatest Story Ever Told was set up at 20th Century Fox. There was a change in management there, and they were not proceeding with it, and then a deal was made with United Artists. The initial deal provided for Stevens to receive a fee of $1 million plus a percentage of the net profits. $1 million in 1960 was by far the largest fee ever paid to a director. It was unheard of. George Stevens was going to spend 3 years of his life on this, so the pressure was on for this unusual fee. The selection of the location was one of the prime concerns, and George and his staff had made an extensive visit to the Holy Land and had considered the possibility of making the film there. Ultimately, it was determined that he would make the location part of the film in Arizona and some in Nevada.
He was possibly one of the most organized men from the point of view of structure. Literary structure, dramatic structure, which also in his own mind he translated into a visual structure.
I have an elaborate interest in the design of a film because I want to keep an audience sitting there for the full period of time the film is on. Films as long as over 3 hours. A film starts, it promises something. If the next sequence doesn't create something of additional interest, there's going to be a loss. Eventually, a loss of people watching the film.
I found myself very stimulated by George's approach. He obviously knew an enormous amount about the life of Christ.
Our scholars, headed by Tony Van Rentingen, has prepared these 2 volumes, which are an extraordinary detailed work, having to do with all of the aspects of the gospel. We can turn to a bookmark here, and we can come to an incident such as the trial by Pontius Pilate. We have the maps of Antonio
the times, the places, and a good deal of information that we'd like to have at our fingertips to do certain aspects of the screenplay, as well as the shooting of the film.
Sometimes when we were writing on the screenplay, he'd begin to concentrate and begin to dictate the scenes. And his concentration was so enormous that his lips would dry up. Even though everybody talks about him as a film director, I think that he was primarily a writer with an extraordinary control of the craft of screenwriting.
One day I heard that a story conference was set up for Saturday, and I joined it. Nobody asked me what I was doing there, nobody told me not to be there, nobody told me to leave. And I sat quietly, and then at one time, near the end of the day, a comment was made about a particular scene. And I suggested, without being asked, that here was a place where something could be cut. Instead of going from this speaker to that speaker, back to this speaker to that speaker, and so forth, you could cut the middle out of that, and the story would move along without any loss of continuity. And Mr. Stevens remarked to me, it was not unfriendly, but it was firm. This is not a ping pong game, and that was the end of the reaction to my comment, and I did not attend any further story conferences.
It was probably at that time one of the biggest and most expensive pictures ever made.
And the budget was extraordinary. I'd never seen such a production, ever.
One of the principal locations would be near Page, Arizona, where Lake Powell is now. At that time, the dam was being built, and the lake would be formed after the dam was closed.
There was an extra pressure because they were delaying flooding the canyon for us. I often think of all those sets where we worked so long, so many, many weeks, now lying under 400 feet of water.
Another major problem in connection with that location is that there was no housing. An entire city practically had to be built. We explored many possibilities, considering the cast and crew and staff living in tents, which is not thought to be very practical for that location.
We'd have 500 buses transporting people from all over the state, maybe 50 or 100 miles that we'd have to house, and extras or local help that we would bring in.
Directing a film and running a military operation are so close as to be almost identical. Supply lines, communication, food, weather, alternate options, morale are all identical in both undertakings. The director must somehow inspire respect, admiration, commitment, and George was marvelous at this.
And so an entire village was built. A huge, huge tent was built for the mess hall, serving hundreds of people.
I think we never had less than 5,000 extras. It was usually 5,000 or better. And that meant maybe 50 or 100 wranglers.
We couldn't find enough camels to rent locally, and we were forced into buying camels. Camels were just part of the menagerie. George, in his desire for a really authentic look, wanted all the animals of the time and of the area that could be assembled, and we really had a zoo. A second location was in Pyramid Lake, Nevada, up near Reno. We had so much commerce that we had a chartered plane that would fly back and forth from Los Angeles 3 days a week.
The casting of Max von Sydow was a brilliant stroke, and I think Max's performance under George's direction is as fine a performance as I've seen. My initial reaction was that I didn't want to do it because I didn't have any plans to do any form of international career, and furthermore, just the idea of playing Jesus Christ in a biblical epic from Hollywood in those days kind of scared me. I had great difficulties really to find my way into this character, which is actually in a way an impossible character to portray, because everybody else knows exactly how he was and what he looked like and what his voice sounded like and so on. In the analysis they had done on Jesus, they stated several times that they were going to show Jesus as Jesus the man, the new Christ. That appealed to me. I remember particularly a scene which I think Sandberg had written, and it was wonderful, very poetic and beautiful. He felt that it would be more interesting to show Jesus as somebody who would be exactly like the rest of us, except for one thing, his direct connection with his Heavenly Father, so to speak. He is the Son of God, but at the same time, just a man with all the human shortcomings. He should not be any form of Superman. He should feel pain just the way we do. Otherwise, his suffering would not be interesting. But at the same time, he should have some kind of enigma. The production started on the River Jordan with a baptism. This was, I think, the 1st of November. It was supposed to be shot already in June, but the production was delayed.
There were a great many good actors, including people like Charlton Heston, standing around ready to go to work and rehearse this big sequence. And as a weather bell, really, he said, I would just like to say a few words about the production before we start. He said, we must always be people. We must never be actors. And it's absolutely brilliant because it's easier said than done. The idea being that you don't want to get caught acting, you know. You must be real.
I remember the local extras who were playing the passionate convertants. Their performances were always incredibly inspired because the temperature of the water was in the mid-40s. And they would come down and step into the water and their eyes would widen and their tendons would stiffen, and I would take them by the shoulders and dip them under, and they would come up and they would look like they had been saved.
Everybody who was being baptized had to wear rubber suits underneath the robes.
We must have worked just on the baptism part for fully 5 days. It was middling miserable, I would say.
I don't know how many times I was dunked in the water, but it was pretty cold, I tell you.
George said, how's it going, Chuck? Just general amenity. And I said, it's okay, George, but I'll tell you this, if the Jordan had been as cold as the Colorado, Christianity never would have got off the ground.
And he opted to use Panavision's spherical system, which we called Super Panavision, 70 millimeter. And so we had lenses ready for him and cameras ready for him. But we also had another system called Ultra Panavision, which was even wider. It was Super Panavision, 70 millimeter with a slight squeeze. So I put a reel of test footage in Ultra Panavision on the screen. Now this was about 3 weeks or 2 weeks before the picture was going to start. And he looked at it and he said, yes, well now that's what I want to use, not Super Panavision. And I said, well, it's a little late, George. We don't have enough lenses for you. He said, I'm sure you'll get them in time. And I said, well, you're going to have to start with 1 or 2 lenses. And he said, well, that's all right. I want to use this big system. I wasn't so happy with myself for making the suggestion because it meant that we would have to be working many, many nights to get this equipment for him.
We usually had 2 to 3 complete camera crews. While one was shooting with the main unit, another one was out doing second unit, maybe a third would be lining up shots, and then George would come and check that. He'd go from location to location. We always had a helicopter, and we would fly from spot to spot. We would photograph various locations, and then come back and show them to George. When I say photograph, it's not a question of taking some still pictures. We'd actually go in there with a 35 millimeter camera and shoot 5 or 10 minutes of film, and then run that, have a process, then run it for George and show him the terrain and see whether or not it would work for what he had in mind. 90% of the time we went back and redid them, but each time we did, we found out that there was little things that, little touches that he would add that made it that much better.
These extraordinary landscapes, it offers fantastic excitement visually. Each of these compositions is a matter of the moment, you know, being there on the right day so that you would have those kind of visual moments in the film.
Incredibly beautiful landscapes, particularly the Sermon on the Mount, which was shot between Colorado and Arizona. It was difficult to do because one is easily upstaged by vistas like that.
It wasn't my experience that he did a great many takes on a scene, but he would do an incredible amount of coverage, and a kind of coverage that was so photographically resourceful and so creatively inventive that it staggered the imagination.
He would work, I think, very fast if you consider the amount of footage that he shot. There is the scene of the Lord's Prayer, where it was all set up to be in a certain place at sunrise, and there were 29 setups done in half an hour.
With George, you work very, very long hours. We'd start early in the morning at maybe 6:30 and get a dawn shot, and then have a breakfast around 9 or 10 in the morning, and then wait, or be rehearsing or going into another sequence, and then also at the end of the day get a dusk shot. A lot of times people felt that his pictures were expensive. They were expensive only because he was a perfectionist.
He was pressed for time all the time on this production. I think it was scheduled for 3 months and it took 9. He always had a terrible pressure on him, and it took him sometimes a day to really decide how he was going to stage the first scene.
We'd sit down usually, he roped off the set, and then he had a discussion. He asked me to come around and bring up any notes I may have had about the scene.
And then he would think about it and send away the actors and have a long conference with his cameraman. Then he might call in the actors again and maybe send them away again. It could take a day to really decide how he was going to stage the first scene.
I asked him many times, "Don't you ever think about camera angles or anything like that before you go on the set?" "Never," he said. "Otherwise, when I get there, I get bored."
In The Last Supper, we'd rehearsed it for several days, and everything was in its proper place, and we felt we were all rehearsed and ready to shoot this. Everybody had their beards on, and everybody was ready to go. And he didn't want to start shooting it for some reason. And finally, he asked everybody if they would leave or sit behind him. And he sat in a production chair, and he looked at the set for at least 2 hours. And we all looked at each other like, what's he doing? Finally, he said, "I want that lamp lowered. I want that lamp raised a little bit. And I want that lamp raised a little bit." And they did it, and he said, "Good, let's shoot it." And we went in and started shooting the sequence. And everybody was fascinated. What on earth was so important about that? So, being youthful, I went up to him and I said, "George, why? What did you do? What's so important about that?" And he said, "That symbolizes to me the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost." The symbolism, every note was important to George Stevens.
In order to shoot a master, let's say we are in a studio, on a stage, and we have a 4-wall hall or something built on the stage. Then he staged the scene, say close to one wall. Then he took out the opposite wall and went as far away as he could with a camera, put up the camera and got a master shot of the scene from there. Then he gradually worked himself closer and closer to the group of people. Many master shots until he was as close as he could come and still include the entire group. Then he went for, say we were 5 people on the stage. Then he had 3 shots in that direction, and 2 shots in that direction. Then he went closer, had medium shots of maybe 2 shots, medium shots. Then maybe medium shots of single medium shots of everybody, from everybody's point of view. Then he had close-ups of everybody from everybody's point of view. When the director works himself closer and closer, you have to repeat exactly what you did. So the director later on will be able to match the different takes, because you have no idea which take he's going to use. It was very tough, very tough. It took a lot of concentration, but it was very good.
When we were in the Holy Land on this trip this spring for 2 or 3 months, going over the places, the scenes and the ground that this great story was enacted upon, we felt we needed to see the presence and measure the distance to bring this across properly on the screen. We certainly took a lot of pictures, and we did considerable recording of soundtracks, which are very helpful at these times. For instance, this is a shepherd's pipe that we recorded. This instrument was first played, this particular instrument, 1900 years ago. And the tradition of playing it's been passed on down through the years. I wish you'd listen.
George he played music. He would find out the music that worked on you or the sound effects that worked on you.
He had music made by Alfred Newman. He had also, I think, more primitive Oriental music, which he used at times. And this created a very interesting feeling on the stage. George Stevens was a great cameraman, of course. I don't know how many pictures he had shot before he became a director. And he paid so much attention to the light. Almost all the scenes which were shot indoors were shot in some kind of half shadows, chiaroscuro.
George wanted the scene to begin in the darkness of the cell. And he said, I don't want to see anything except silhouettes and shadows until the Baptist opens his eye. I was sitting in chains with my arms around my knees and my head down. And he said, when he opens his eye, that's what I want to see. But George walked on the set and he said, that's too much light, Lyle. And he said, no, George, no, this is, he said, Lyle, too much light. I just want to see his eye. And only an ex-cameraman could have said that, of course.
When you start being on location for as long as the time as we did, things become more and more complicated. Mutiny among the actors.
There were a lot of wonderful actors in that piece, but it's very easy for actors to complain behind someone's back. Oh, why does he do this? Why does he do that? Why does he take so long?
The mood was light. There was a kind of relaxed mood, yet there was a concern that you would make a mistake.
He was not shy about speaking through the loudspeakers and explaining to everybody in the whole wide world what he thought your problem was at any given moment, you know. I remember at one point, it was very hot. We were at a place called Dead Horse Point, and we were waiting for them to set up a shot, and I happened to lay down and put a handkerchief over my face to keep the sun off my face. He thought I was asleep. And he told the whole world through these loudspeakers that if I would pay more attention and wouldn't sleep on the job, I might be a better actor. But the other side of the coin was, you could approach him. You could take any problem you might have to George Stevens, and he would listen to you.
When I felt that I had what I thought was a good suggestion, I talked to Mr. Stevens about it. He listened, and most of the times he either said, well, I don't want to know your motivations. I'm not interested in your motivations. And I said, well, maybe I can do something like this. And he said, yes, why don't you do that? And that was it.
Max von Sydow wanted to see George and couldn't get to see him. And in desperation, he left a message and said, tell him his son is here to see him, because he was playing Christ at the time. The next thing, George was laughing. The next thing, the two of them walking arm in arm down the road together.
I saw him as a father figure. Most people, I think, related to George as a father figure.
He taught me that what goes on behind the camera, the relationships you establish with your fellow actors and the director, will always show in front. I once asked for aren't I going to get a close-up here? I don't know what it was. And he said, Shelley, all right, I'll do a close-up. He said, but what's fascinating in films and the theater is not what you do or the other person. It's what goes on in between the air between you. And so if you can get that powerful thing on the screen or on the stage, that's what fascinates an audience. I went to the George Stevens Film School, I guess.
All I'm saying is, someone has taken my coat. Be not troubled about your coat. See the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. But even Solomon in all his glory was never arrayed like one of these.
This was shot, I think, in December. He had to put in all the flowers there, real lilies.
And one day we got a request for many, many gallons of many colors of paint. And we couldn't understand what in the world the paint was for.
We had real flowers in the foreground, plastic flowers halfway, to give it a sort of a feeling of lilies of the field.
And further back, he simply painted the desert.
They sent to the studio for yellow paint, for 800 gallons of yellow paint. And we sat on the set waiting for this yellow paint to arrive.
He sprayed the desert yellow and red and blue. And it came out beautifully, I think.
He felt that it should be a story of understanding instead of a story which caused conflict and animosity. I think also he was influenced by his experience in the war.
I think that film is connected with the extraordinary experience he had when he entered the concentration camps, when he entered Dachau, what he saw there. When you start tackling the story of Jesus from a Judo-Christian point of view, I remember that many times he said, it takes some doing to make an anti-Jewish story out of the story of Jesus. I mean, after all, that's where he came from, that's who he was.
The story of Christ is obviously one of the most difficult stories you can possibly tell, because everyone, Christian, Jew, Muslim, Buddhist, atheist, agnostic, has a very firm idea of what Christ should be like and what place his story has in the world and history. No one can fulfill all those deeply held convictions.
I'm sure many people would be offended just to see another version than their own on the screen. There is a scene in the beginning of the picture when the Holy Family returns from Egypt. They are confronted by a long line of crosses of crucified people who have been executed because there's been an uprising.
Suddenly you'd pass this row of crosses, maybe 300 or 400 crosses, that stretched into the distance.
The fact that Mr. Stevens had the courage to show this line, that raised a lot of criticism, because, as you might have noticed, in the pictures of Golgotha, nobody is supposed to be crucified like Christ in order to give people the idea that he was the only one who really was crucified. So showing all these hundreds or thousands of people being crucified, that was something which was rather bold.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth, as it is in heaven.
You have another problem with the Lord's Prayer. It ends differently. The Protestant version and the Catholic version are not the same. There are different endings. So which one should you use? Which one should you offend? Which one should you please there?
The ecumenical point of view, which is very strong in the picture, was disliked by a lot of people. We had a concept of making that particular story extremely universal. I remember that a lot of attention was given to the casting of the picture. When Jesus walks to the cross and talks to the women of Jerusalem, we cast all the race of the world.
Before I started working on The Greatest Story Ever Told, I didn't really know anything about the Jewish religion. I got wonderful opportunities to study this because of the group of Israeli dancers who were extras in the film. Wonderful dance group called the Inbal Dancers. The leader of that group, she also helped find movements which Jesus might have used when he prayed. How should one do? Should we do like this, which we see on paintings, or should we do like this, which we see little children do when they say their prayers? Mr. Stevens was very interested in this too, and took part in this. Then, of course, there was the question of the miracles, of Jesus' miracles. We reached the agreement that Jesus should not do his miracles just like that. It should be done with a tremendous effort. Say, a great effort of faith, of will.
I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live.
I've never seen better acting in film. His scene of the raising of Lazarus, it was an awesome piece of work.
Lazarus' tomb, where Lazarus comes back from the dead, was a long, slow, dramatic sequence. And at one point, Lazarus' tomb was set into the rocks, into the mountain. And it was very cold there. And the only steps leading down to the ground level were carved into this rock. And the girls who played Mary and Martha, they had to wear bare feet, you know. And they had to use a blowtorch to warm up the rock so that their feet wouldn't stick to the rock. And that's absolutely true. It was cold, bitter.
We had scouted the location very carefully. We had found out that in 50 years it would never snow during a certain period, and it snowed. We woke up at 5:30 in the morning. You opened up and you saw the whole valley covered. Not too much, just about 2 inches of snow. What are you going to do? George Stevens decided that the only thing to do was to shovel it out.
Pretty soon he had a crew, and before the day was out, every man and woman was out there shoveling snow and wiping it off, including Big George.
The crew didn't have to get out there, and every member of that crew was out there helping them melt the snow on the location. And we worked all day, George and everybody, with the flamethrowers, and we swept the set clean. It snowed the next morning. He was really unhappy.
The company was forced to move out of that location and come back to the studio and then go back at a later time and complete the work. That was a terrible imposition on the making of the picture. And George Stevens was very, very concerned about the mounting costs. He had no tendency whatever to say it's their problem, because he felt it was his problem too. So he was caught in this turmoil of the schedule being elongated and costs going up.
We had all the time, every day, all day long, somebody of United Artists producers sitting on the set, which I'm sure George Stevens did not like.
George's method came to be known as the Indian look. When George started shooting a film, after about 2 weeks of shooting, he'd be 4 months behind. And at that point, the producer would come on the stage and tear his hair. George would ask him very politely to sit down and listen and look at him and never say anything. And the man went on very reasonably about all the problems of financing and everything else. And after about 10 or 20 minutes, when the producer finally ran out of gas, George would say thank you very much and get up, walk away, and continue what he was doing, which we thought was very good.
To finish the film faster than might otherwise be anticipated, he allowed David Lean and Jean Negulesco, who volunteered to do so out of their respect for George. He allowed them to come in and shoot several scenes in the film that could be accomplished at the studio while George was photographing on location. But he did not make any sacrifices in the film as he believed it should be done.
George knew that he gave everything because he wasn't feeling well at the time. I know that he had an ulcer or something, bleeding ulcer, whatever.
I don't remember exactly how long we shot. I think 8 or 9 months. By the time that ended, if it had had another week to go, I don't think he'd have made it. Nobody could keep going like that. You know, it's just not possible. We thought he was going to be the greatest director up in Forest Lawn.
George had unusual habits in connection with the post-production of the film. Post-production to him was as meticulous as the photography, if not more so.
When he did a lap dissolve from one scene to another, it was not merely for transitional purposes.
You have this image, and another image is going to be superimposed onto this image. He was talking about the disintegration of one image and the other image being superimposed on top of it and making it work as association of contrasting images.
In order to do this, he had a technique in the cutting room which, to me, was unique. He had multiple projection machines and had a control panel with buttons whereby he could run any or all of them forward or in reverse. He would play one scene against the other so that they would both be projected simultaneously on the cutting room screen, and maybe one would be fading out, the other would be fading in, all of which he manipulated with his buttons.
You see it from a more poetic point of view. It's elevated, a step up, and thereby becoming even more convincing and also much more interesting.
This is very much a style of his, which I think is apparent in The Place in the Sun, and is apparent in The Greatest Story Ever Told.
George was criticized at one point for having famous people do little tiny cameos. John Wayne had one line. Carol Baker was in the picture. I don't know if she spoke, but Pat Boone had one line.
I'm sure it was very tempting to realize that you could go to almost any actor, Van Haffen, Sidney Poitier, Shelley Winters, Sal Mineo, Robert Blake, and say, I'd like you to be in the picture, and he would be in the picture. Much of the casting worked marvelously, but it did produce an unavoidable sense of, oh, there's so-and-so. And that was Sidney Poitier that took the cross.
Nobody would ever ask George anything about this because people were too afraid to get that close to it. But I asked him, I said, how do you feel about the fact that there are big stars doing little tiny parts and stuff? And he said, Mr. Anderson, he always called me Mr. Anderson. He said, Mr. Anderson, many years from now, your grandchildren will not know who Carol Baker is or Pat Boone or who those people are, and they will judge the movie on its own merits as a movie. I think he was a very far-thinking person.
Nearly all great artists, great Christian artists, eventually turn to religious art.
The ego of the artist again, to deal with the subject matter that Da Vinci has dealt with, Tintoretto, Salvatore Dali, an area that has been of interest to great artists of the past.
And this is what George was concerned with, bringing in not only the art of painting, which is obviously necessary for the screen, because those are paintings in movement, but bringing music, and I don't mean the score, but I mean the music of silent things.
And I was talking to George about this once. He said, yeah, that's perfectly true. He said, it's just shadows, you see. He said, there's nobody up there. He said, you shoot the actors doing the scene, and they can move you beyond measure, sitting behind the camera. But he said, then you look at them on film, and there's no blood there, it's just shadows. And he said, it's part of the director's task to put the blood back in it.
George Stevens was very proud of The Greatest Story Ever Told when the film was finished, and he continued to be so throughout his life.
One thing is true, by the time we got through making the film, the audience for whom we made the film no longer was going to the movies.
I have an idea. Greatest Story was disappointing to George, if only in that it did not receive the critical acclaim that most of his films did.
Every artist, I guess, wants good reviews from everybody, but George took the reviews quite in stride. I think he had his own inner confidence in what he had sought to accomplish and what he had in fact accomplished.
I don't know if this was his personal version or vision of Christ. I don't know. I think it was. I think he came close to his vision. I think so.
Every shot conveyed much more than the eye saw. There was a kind of a wonderful way of making the invisible visible, the hidden visible.
It is perhaps one of the most magnificent artistic works in the life of Christ that has ever been done in any medium. There is a soft movement that almost carries you from the beginning of the picture until you have that marvelous, uplifting finale.
The greatest story ever told is a magnificent picture, stunningly rendered for the screen. A monumental film. It may run for 40 years. The greatest story ever told could be the most majestic production the screen will ever have. One of the greatest motion pictures yet made. Pictorially magnificent. A classic, timeless picture.
Behold, I send my messenger, who shall prepare the way. Listen to the voice of one crying in the wilderness, one whose sandals I am not worthy to carry.
Who are you? Baptize me, John.
What is your name, my friend?
James. Little James. They call me Little because I'm the youngest. What is your name?
Jesus.
That's a good name.
Thank you. You have judged her rightly. She is guilty of adultery.
The law calls for her to be stoned.
Yes. Let him among you who is without sin cast the first stone.
Lazarus, come forth!
What happened?
Did you see?
See?
Well, Jesus of Nazareth. I saw it with my own eyes. Lazarus was dead. Now, he's alive!
in a land as desolate and beautiful as the surface of the moon, the kind of timeless setting that saw the beginning of man, a motion picture classic has been created by an extraordinary filmmaker, George Stevens.
Sitting up on this ladder, watching Stevens direct is an experience. I have seen many films made, but this stands out because the story, the people involved in it, the dramatic touch and the way he brings it out, it's absolutely exciting to be part of it. And these actors standing there on the cold ground become the part they're playing. They're not actors any longer, they're living the parts.
George has a terrific sense of composition, and he also has a great ability as far as lighting is concerned. Having been a cameraman himself, he has much more understanding of the camera than any other director I think that I've ever worked with.
George has the fantastic ability to make an actor believe that he is the creator of the role, whereas in reality, he is actually dropping hints about the character, things he wants to come out in the characterization. He'll make a suggestion, he'll drop it very quietly, and then later, you suddenly find that you have incorporated his suggestion so that you really think that you've done it yourself.
All right, camera. All right, action.
Each scene is the culmination of an idea that began in Stevens' mind over 5 years ago. He had read many versions of the life of Jesus and seen most of the films. But to get even closer to the essence of things, Stevens and his associates flew to the Holy Land. Here, standing by the Sea of Galilee, he studies the waters where Simon fished. At the tomb of Lazarus, he tries to picture the reaction of the mourners viewing the resurrected figure. To get a sense of how the everyday world of 2,000 years ago looked and felt, Stevens visits the huts and meets with the simple, unspoiled herdsmen of the isolated farm villages which have retained much of their ancient flavor. On the shores of the Dead Sea, he visits the ruins of the Essene settlement, and at Baalbek, he contemplates the towering columns that once looked down upon a thriving civilization. To Stevens, each spot is alive with meaning. Because perhaps the young Jesus stood there, preached there, or prayed there. The tour convinced Stevens that the greatest story ever told could not be filmed in the Holy Land. 2,000 years of civilization had unalterably changed the face of the land. In order to capture the rugged grandeur of ancient Palestine, Stevens turns to the American Southwest. Its endless vistas and awe-inspiring canyons are a fit setting for the broad sweep of Christ's ideas, and instantly remind us of the universal forces that surround the fragile life of man. tireless searching, Stevens finds 3 locations that he likes: Moab, Utah, Pyramid Lake, Nevada, and this, the Glen Canyon region of southern Utah. The Colorado River draws a striking resemblance to the River Jordan of ancient times, and Stevens decides to film the scene of Jesus' encounter with John the Baptist here. For a deeper understanding of Jesus, Stevens turns to poet Carl Sandburg.
He is the legend of the universal man, the man who comprised all of humanity. The dominant nations of the globe have adopted the Christ figure as the ideal man, and yet the goodness, the very peculiarly sensitive set of sympathies that there were in him made him what you might call the universal man, a figure having powers that no other man ever had that walked the earth.
It was most necessary for there to be a Messiah, a Savior, at this particular moment, because the persistence of man's inhumanity to himself was enormously evident at this time. The aspects of the story that are so fascinating, the great belief of this little group of people around Jesus, and their enormous doubts, the doubts that confronted them when they let Jesus, their master, their leader, their loved one, stand alone and say to his strongest ones, look at these frail people, they're not with me. And then turn and ask the question, if I must drink this cup, I will, but if it can be taken from me, spare me. And see this enormous tide of doubt engulf this story that became a resurgence in a few days' time and has gone on down through the passage of years.
Every scene of the final script was translated into hundreds of paintings by artists David Hall and André Girard. Using them as a guide and working closely with Stevens, art director Richard Day created over 50 set models. Each one was studied by Stevens and evaluated for authenticity, dramatic feeling, and visual potential. And finally, 15 were approved for construction. To design the costumes, Stevens selected the talented Italian artist and wardrobe historian, Nino Novarese.
For me, it's absolutely impossible to dress a man if I don't know his character, his mood, his way of living. I think each man in his own period is a modern man. And I always try to have this dress the most near to the truth, to the reality. If a man is a viril man, a strong man, and he believes most in the strength that in the spiritual thing, he will choose in the life a different job. Or an old man with a disease like blindness, he will have a sort of resignation in his aspect. It's the same for the women. A young girl, a virgin type of girl, will wear different clothes because she has to express her soul, and they represent a sort of protection. A woman, the life of what is based on a glamour, will show more his body and his beauty, because in the same way, this is her protection. Mr. Stevens' characters are real men and women, real human beings, and so the costume, they belong to each one of them.
It's a small group.
While the sets and costumes were being developed, Stevens met with his staff in a continuing series of conferences to discuss the dynamics of each scene.
In the other room is the party. I mean, the court people and the dancers and Herodia with the girl. No. So at the moment, the girl joined the group of the dancers, and she go into the door
and she looks into the curtains, and she sees the king alone in the room.
The king will not be urged, will not be put upon, will not be directed to destroy this Baptist man who he's in a contest with. So he walks away from them, does not hear their heedings. As he walks into the dark, cloistered cell where the Baptist is, this music pursues him. It is the one continuity that links this little group of saints. A time comes when the Baptist provokes the king to destroy him, and the king orders his destruction, and the king comes back into the throne room, and he's alone in the dark. And he's thinking, what have I done? The music has grown louder and louder. We feel as an accompaniment to the king's passion when we see the girl is still dancing. And in the room, the dance has grown gayer and higher, and the girl comes in with not enough light. We see her again like a firefly. And as the king is tormented by his own being used to commit taking of a life that it wasn't quite his motive to do himself, now he is stirred by the movement of the girl, the charm, the grace, the delight of the girl dancing around him that can afford him no pleasure. She designs a tightening circle around him until she's closer and closer. And the man doesn't understand the beat of his own heart any longer, or the sound. They can't help him. The rhythm can't help him. It'd be a nice thing.
After 4 years of preparation, ground is broken, and a vast army of skilled technicians begin to reconstruct the Holy Land of Christ's time. Animals of every type prevalent in biblical Palestine are rounded up and trained for work before the cameras.
Get around there.
With the sets in readiness, 400 actors and technicians move into the location camp, a modern village of 115 aluminum cottages, complete with dining tent, recreation hall, and clinic, built by Stevens to provide them with every comfort. Every morning at daybreak, anywhere from 50 to 1,000 extras are admitted to the wardrobe tent and fitted out with costumes for the day's shooting. Indians from the nearby Navajo reservation are convincing Near Eastern types. Then each extra is rapidly transformed into an authentic Palestinian by a team of expert makeup artists, applying carefully pre-planned techniques. In the less hurried atmosphere of another makeup room, the leading actors, who've been recruited from Broadway, Europe, and Hollywood, are readied for the close scrutiny of the camera. John Considine plays the part of the Apostle John. Joanna Dunham, a young actress of great dramatic power from England's Old Vic, is Mary Magdalene. Using talent and rightness for the part as his only criteria, Stevens has chosen relative unknowns to play along with such celebrated stars as Charlton Heston, Van Heflin, John Wayne, Sidney Poitier, Dorothy McGuire, Ed Wynn, and Roddy McDowell. to mention only a few. For additional atmosphere, Stevens invited the Inballs, Israel's high-spirited ballet troupe, to join his cast.
Wally, is he ready on those dials?
All right, here we go.
All right, move the woman in just a touch to her right.
All right, Paul?
That's awful critical. I'd rather keep it
Well,
that way.
there'll be something in there, otherwise it's dead.
All right, Paul. Here we go. All ready, sir.
All right, camera. All right, action.
Where are you going?
Try and get ahead of him a little bit.
Lunch for a cast and crew that at times number 1,500 is a major problem of logistics. A kitchen on wheels follows the company to wherever they are working and serves them a hot meal. Each in his own way relaxes in the warm desert sun. Lunch hour over, Assistant Director Wendell Franklin calls the company back to work, and the massive complex of men and machines necessary to make a modern motion picture begins to roll again.
All right, action.
After a long, hard day, spirits run high in the dining tent, particularly when Elliot Ellisophan, Stevens' brilliant color consultant and self-styled gourmet, insists on illustrating the art of salad making.
We've got Italian olive oil in here, French vinegar. We've got lemon juice from California, a little garlic.
I'd like to look out the salad. Just give me a glass of dressing.
Salad is terrible. The salad is terrible. The salad is terrible. The salad is terrible.
In the projection room, however, work continues. With his aides gathered about him, Stevens carefully studies scenes filmed the previous day. He decides which ones are right in every detail and which must be filmed again, and perhaps again, until the perfection he demands has been attained. In the recreation tent, the in-balls give an impromptu performance to the delight of the company. Late into the night, while the rest of the camp sleeps, Stevens continues working in his trailer office, plotting the next day's camera angles and searching for ways to get the most dramatic effects from his cast and crew. With the location work completed, the company eagerly anticipates its return to the big city. 4 specially chartered super constellations fly them back to Los Angeles, where sets have been prepared at Stevens' Culver City Studios for the filming of interiors.
Causing irritation, tumult, as we know. And if you've come here...
The interior of Lazarus's house. Stevens prepares the scene where Mary Magdalene anoints Jesus. Jesus is portrayed by the great Swedish actor Max von Sydow.
Bill, that looks beautiful, doesn't it?
Stevens uses no fancy camera tricks, and yet every composition is filled with a great sense of power and excitement. He and his cameraman Bill Meller have found a close creative rapport.
The other angle in the book?
No. Now we have to find something to finish with. Sort of includes everything.
The shooting over, Stevens joins film editor Harold Kress for what he considers one of the most important phases in the filmmaking process. From his new editorial point of view, Stevens considers the hundreds of hours of picture and sound recorded in the months of shooting as raw material that must now be shaped into a unified, dramatic whole. He covers each scene so thoroughly that he has the complete freedom to edit it from any point of view. As a result of this tremendous flexibility, all of Stevens' films have a surprising sense of spontaneity and vitality. Stevens carries the same flexibility and desire for perfection through all the other phases of completing his film. The music scoring, the mixing of the soundtrack, and finally the release prints made by Technicolor. Now modern technology takes over, condensing onto celluloid every idea, every dramatic gesture, every nuance of color that existed in Stephen's mind. A ribbon of ideas that will be printed into thousands of copies, flown to every corner of the globe, and seen in the exciting form of Cinerama by over 100 million people.
Strangely about a film, there is only really one time of impact. That's at the moment you have it all together and you present it to a group of people gathered there specifically for the purpose of seeing it from beginning to end, and you find them all there, or most of them, hopefully, when the film is concluded in that showing. And that is an impact. One has to sort of be patient and wait and go on with their work with very much that idea in mind of watch that audience that night as a jury, tell them whether the message has been conveyed or whether it has been errant in its objective, and dismiss them. And when a film does communicate with an audience, for the filmmaker, it is a moment of impact.
In a scientific age that considers the teachings of ancient Nazareth outdated and naive, George Stevens, in his film, The Greatest Story Ever Told, reminds us that they are more meaningful today than ever before.
You have heard that it has been said, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor." But I say unto you, love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them that hate you. And pray for them that persecute you.